Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench. Hello and welcome to another episode of Fighting on Film. This week we have a Patreon pick. This is a pick by our supporting cast, and it is one I am extremely excited to be covering. We are covering It Happened Here, a 1964 amateur movie which sort of posits an alternate future or alternate past where Nazi Germany successfully invades Britain, and we get a view of this world through the protagonist's eyes. It's an absolutely fascinating film, and the fact that it's an amateur picture just adds to this really interesting sort of feel to the whole thing, where it's impressive what they've achieved. So, Rob, do you want to take us through the plot, and then we'll dive right in?
Sure. So to give you a little brief outline of the plot, the movie starts with a sort of Dad's Army-esque map of Britain and the French coastline.
Like a reverse Dad's Army.
Yeah, like a reverse Dad's Army. Yeah, those pesky German arrows finally crossed the channel. So it's the whole premise is after Dunkirk in 1940, the Wehrmacht invades. They're fought off for a little bit, but then eventually, through sheer determination and a battle we don't see, they finally win and they occupy the country. So the film actually picks up in 1944 when the British resistance movement has died off in the 4 years previously, but now the Americans are in the war. They've stationed their fleet off of Ireland, and they're feeding the resistance with kit and men to sort of try and poise for some sort of invasion. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. As Matt said, it's England under occupation, and you see it through the eyes of our main character, Pauline, who is an Irish nurse. And she is played by Pauline Murray, an amateur actor, who I think she the wife of one of the members of the production crew? Sorry?
Yeah, she was the wife of a friend of Kevin Barlow, one of the directors. Sorry, Kevin Brownlow, one of the directors, who it was suggested that she'd be great as the lead. Way before Brownlow and Mollo had a sort of idea of what the lead was going to be. I think that initially it was going to be perhaps a German Air Force officer or something like that initially, like very near the beginning. This film had like an 8-year production.
Yes. Because
of its amateur sort of aspect. In his book, How It Happened Here, Kevin Brownlow, he literally jokes that the film took longer to produce than the war took to fight. There's a great little video on YouTube at the moment as well, where he says exactly the same thing.
Yes.
Original footage from behind the scenes, and he provided like a commentary track. It's great if you get a chance to look it up online. This is a super ambitious piece made by a young man who was 18 at the beginning of production, and he had this vision where he wanted to create sort of an alternate future where the Nazis had taken over Britain. This idea came from, he was walking through London on the way to work one morning, and he saw this black Citroen pull up outside of a bakery, and two Germans jumped out one was wearing like a long leather black coat, I think he says, and he calls back to him from the door of the bakery. And this whole scene, he said, looked like something out of a war movie.
Right.
But the situation it was in, central London, they're running into an English bakery. It twigged this thought of this alternate sort of
what if scenario.
It sort of grew from that. And Brownlow had been a film collector. He made one short film before this called, I think it's The Prisoners, which is an adaptation of a story from the Franco-Prussian War.
Okay.
Which is set in World War II. So, with very little sort of background and experience, he decides to embark on this huge project, and he begins filming, and he's very precocious, and he manages to sort of set up filming in like central London in Trafalgar Square with people in Nazi uniforms walking around.
Yeah.
But he's struggling to find uniform, kit, stuff that looks authentic. And he happens to meet Andrew Mollo, who was at the time 16. So Mollo's just 16 at this point. So you've got these two young men who are collaborating on this film, which eventually turns out to be hour and 40 long.
Something like an hour and a half, about.
Hour and a half, yeah. And it's just the production value.
Yeah.
I think the film, all told, over about 8 years, was made with, their own money, with loans and with grants from like the BBC and the British Film Institute, etc. And eventually the
United Artists who came on board.
Yeah, the film was completed on about 7,000, and then United Artists came on to distribute. So they didn't fund any of it. So they just picked it up once it had been made. So the best source for where I'm getting all of this from is the book that Brownlow published in 1968, which is How It Happened Here. And it's a fascinating read about how he created this film. Loads of like behind the scenes little tidbits of information. So so we have Pauline Murray, and the only other star of note in the film is Sebastian Shaw, who been a fairly big star in the 40s and was a stage actor. Yeah, and famously he was Darth Vader.
Yeah, Anakin Skywalker, wasn't he, in Return of the Jedi, and played his Force ghost? But that's cut out. Yes, he did
until he was replaced. Shockingly.
By Hayden Christensen in the 15 billionth re-release or whatever.
Yeah. At the beginning of the film, it literally says they thank a cast of hundreds, and they dragged in people. They dragged in an entire village, New Radnor, of extras to play civilians.
The amount of people they drag in off the street. They said they'd get German tourists in to play the characters. They just grab anyone they
could. Former German officers, even members of the SS were involved.
It's amazing, like ad hoc filmmaking that you just don't really see anymore, or if you do, it doesn't get to the heights that this film does.
No. Well, we love these amateur sort of like pictures, don't we? And we've covered them before, and you get that they're taking just people out of the pubs and grabbing bystanders, anyone who looks like a German officer and looks like they fit into the uniform they've got. They drag them out and get them kitted up.
Yeah.
They even like dragged a load of lads from a Borstal, which is like a young offenders school, to be some of the extras for the surrender scene at the end as German soldiers. It's absolutely fascinating. We'll go into some more of it later on, but I mean, even Peter Watkins pops up. Of War Game fame and Culloden and all those great movies we've already covered.
Which this film feels very similar in the way that it's filmed.
There's a vibe to it, and some of the cinematography looks so similar to what Watkins later becomes renowned for.
So the most like those sharp close-ups.
There's a couple of and the scuffles and the motion of the scenes where action's going on,
and how you see the movie through someone's eyes. It's hard to say because it's not a POV film. It's not shot as a POV, but you feel like you're like hovering over the woman, don't you? You feel like you're hovering over Pauline. You're not. You're seeing it from an angle. Nothing in this film is, I don't think, presented in a positive or a negative light.
No. Well, even with some of those, the interviews with the nursing staff from the hospital at the end.
Oh, yes.
That's very sort of like Watkins Vox Pop.
Yeah, it is.
Stuff, isn't it? But it's weird because in the book that Brownlow doesn't actually say that Watkins had any input on direction or camera work. He was doing set dressing, costume coordination, wrangling extras. He was doing a bit of makeup work. So how much input he had and how much he learned from being on this production, who knows? Fascinating though.
Really interesting.
So yeah, I guess we can just talk a little bit about the film and how it progresses in the plot, and then we can jump into the alley tally, because this film has a surprising amount of stuff to talk about as well,
doesn't it? Yes.
So as Rob was saying, we follow Pauline, who is a nurse, and the film begins in a remote English village. The Germans are on the run, the partisans are rife in the countryside, and it starts with she's trying to get on a transport convoy to London, but the trucks are full. So her and a group of her friends are left behind, and they find themselves back at home in their house. And during the night, the partisans arrive in the village, as well as some German forces. And there's a bit of an ambush of the German convoy, and a lot of Pauline's friends are killed. And it's a great sort of nighttime shoot where it's just chaotic.
Yeah, you've got a clue. I mean, I think it might be down to the print that we watched.
Yeah.
But like, you don't have a clue who's shooting at who or who's getting hit or what's happening. And then Pauline just makes it out.
There's like a muzzle flash lit face of one of the women as she crumples to the ground.
German officer buys it.
And apparently, according to the book, that shooting from the top of the house, which you can just barely see in the print,
You just make it out,
was Mollo on the roof with a rifle. And apparently everyone in the village went mad because they didn't know what was going on.
Oh, wow.
And then from there, it sort of follows Pauline into London. She makes it into London on her own. And then we get this really fascinating sort of progression of her becoming involved in the IA, which is sort of like a fascist paramilitary.
They're called Immediate Action, the Immediate Action Organisation. And they use the British Union of Fascists flash logo that Mosley and his crew were using in the 30s. So I assume in the narrative of the movie, like they're the next step. You know, they're the ones that they're sort of like the puppet government.
Definitely. And did you spot the frame picture of Mosley next to Hitler in the IA office?
We would assume again,
very clever.
Mosley is prime minister or whatever they're calling it now in the narrative, but he's not really mentioned that much. To be fair, no, they don't.
Not by name, anyway.
Not by name, no. But just that little section of Pauline getting into London, because she mentions that she's not been to London for many years. She's been living in the countryside, I think, and living in Ireland, perhaps. You just see how things are different through her eyes. And it's little things at the start. It's like a policeman walking down the road with a German military policeman. Just subtleties, the policeman's armed, which is another little thing that I didn't really pick up on until the second viewing. Signs everywhere saying street parties are forbidden. There's barbed wire in places. There's propaganda posters. Yeah, exactly. Like ubiquitous, propaganda posters, things like that. And signage is like Germanized as well.
Yeah.
It's just really little things that it doesn't need to batter you over the head that England is or London is under occupation, because we're 4 years in. It's the subtlety of everything that I really enjoyed seeing and how it was dealt with. And then when she clearly looks into that, which is clearly a ghetto in London.
Yeah, we get that sign where it's like Juden forbidden, etc. And it's all in that sort of instantly recognizable like Nazi font, the German font.
Gothic looking.
Yes, the Gothic font. And that was all hand painted, according to the book. He and Mollo just literally like hand painted all those from photographs and books. So the amount of research they must have done is pretty impressive.
Yeah, well, Mollo obviously goes on to be a military advisor, historian in his own right, written a dozen books about military uniforms and German uniforms. So, everything for a 16-year-old to get it that spot on is very impressive as well. He's doing his research is top notch.
Yeah, it's impressive. It stands up really well. And that's one of the things, when Brownlow shows him some of the first footage he'd filmed without Mollo before he came on board. He just criticized the uniforms and how they were being worn and all this.
Mollo loved the alley tally, wouldn't he?
Book, I know, right? There's bits in the book where there's on-set discussion about how you would wear a holster. German officer would wear his holster.
Right.
Like a guy that used to be in the Luftwaffe was like, no, we would wear it at the back. And like a Latvian SS officer was like, no, we wore them at the front. They're all sort of like disagreeing with one another. And it's just that level of sort of attention to detail that's fascinating. And having those, those kind of individuals on a set.
Of course, yes.
Very interesting. But that's something we'll talk a bit more about when we come to some of the other scenes. I think that's that scene where Pauline is walking into London and it's the desolation of the bomb sites, which is building sites still in the late 50s, early 60s. Her despondency in that desolation, where she's sat on the corner and there's some kids playing in the far off background. That's when the film sort of begins to hit you.
It's all very familiar, but different.
And that's the beauty of it. I think you're getting those quintessential sort of British English scenes with stuff that is quite clearly German from that period.
And like the amount of like Nazification of things as well. Areas that are going to be more populated seem to have more propaganda in them and signage and iconography and symbols.
Absolutely.
And obviously just normal streets and things like that just don't. And I think it's that little touches as well. You don't have to have like, banners and flags everywhere, because obviously if it's not important to the occupying forces, they're not going to pay attention to like, King Street or whatever.
No.
Pick a generic street number 5. They're not going to give a shit. They're going to focus on what's important to making the regime work, rather than like, oh, does every street have signage and is a propaganda poster up here? As I said, it's the subtleties for me that sort of really work to.
It's the inclusion of getting a bus and having sort of a little bit of Nazification on there, and then just a standard advert from the period, getting period vehicles from collectors of older vehicles. So like some of the newsreel footage takes collectors' cars from like the 30s, and they're seen driving past. Just the fact that they went, we could get that, and they include it. It's
and
mad.
Asking the extras to bring along 40s clothing if they have any from back in the day. It's all little things like that. I think like an amateur filmmaker has to do that because they have to think on their feet, and because it's all people's own clothing and things like that, everything just looks natural. That's the word. Everything looks natural. Nothing feels forced, and I think that's another massive feather in this film's cap, that it's all very uneasily believable.
It creates that mise en scène, and a lot of the sort of inspiration for that touches of Nazification within the street scenes, etc., comes from a book they got their hands on of photographs, and it's official photographs and snapshots taken by civilians. It was published in 1945 of Paris. It was published by the French Liberation Forces, and it was a book all about Paris occupied.
Oh well,
they managed to recreate little bits of signage and what posters look like, and the general things that the Nazis did when they occupied a place, which.
It's all based in fact, isn't it?
It's just very impressive that they managed to get that material.
So I think, because we'll talk more about certain things as we go on, I think maybe we should just dive into the alley tally.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
It's time for Alley Tally on Fighting on Film.
So Matt, I understand today you're going to talk about the German kit.
Yeah, there's plenty in here, isn't there?
It's chock full.
The film begins with this really impressive sequence. Now, when you watch that introduction at the beginning of the film with the battle scenes, did you think that was filmed, or did you think that was possibly like some newsreel that they used? Or
so right, I wasn't too sure. On a second viewing, it's obvious it's for the movie. You're right. There are certain bits within the film that don't feel like they were filmed for the movie.
Yeah.
So like, I'll talk about it in my favourite scene, but there's a film they see in the cinema in London that the main character watches, that just doesn't feel like it was made for the movie. It feels like it's been dug out of some the Bundesarchive or something. But yeah, that initial sequence with troops just running around and trucks driving, it does feel very much like captured footage, doesn't it?
It does. It's got that bombastic German marching song going over the top of it with an announcer voice. So it's very much out of like the classic.
It's like it's from the Deutsche Wochenschau, like their own newsreels.
Newsreels, exactly. On first watch, because I've been looking forward to doing this film for such a long time. So it's been on the list for quite a while. So I was so glad when the patrons picked this film. I was disappointed when Hornblower lost, but I was pleased when it happened here once.
It's becoming a running joke that Hornblower just doesn't get voted for.
It was so close this time, Rob. I was so angry.
It's getting there. Yeah, Peck was pipped at the post yet again.
When I first watched it, I thought, is this newsreel? And then when a Jagdpanther rolls by, you're like, Jesus, this can't be stuff that they shot themselves. Where the hell did they get a Jagdpanther? And then we get a half-track launching rockets and a building exploding. And it's at that point you go, no, there's no way that two young lads, which I didn't even know about at this point, you know, when I was watching it for the first time, that there's no way that an amateur film can be blowing up a building and there's a Jag Panther rolling by and all these lads. There's about 6 different, you know, scenes where it's just different German kit going at it. It's insane.
Yeah.
And to realize that it was, you know, filmed in Wiltshire with a bit of help from the Tank Museum. It's incredible.
Tank Museum giving help, which is just lend these teenagers that are Jag Panther.
Yeah.
You know.
So the way that they managed to do all of that was they Mollo was quite friendly with Mark Dineley, who was a part owner of the Bapty Film Armourers.
Okay.
And Dineley offered to let them come down to his farm in Wiltshire and blow up one of his tenant farmers' outbuildings.
Wow.
As you do.
Yeah.
And he said, I'll let you use the kit and the vehicles that I've got. And true to his word, they filmed a few weekends there. So that brilliant opening scene where they're attacking like a farm building and the partisans like letting rip with a brain gun out the window.
Really well done set piece for an amateur production.
It's incredibly good.
Yeah.
Which is all, it surprises me, honestly, that they managed to get footage that good so early on when he was still learning how to make a film. It's really interesting that they managed to get all these little cut bits. So I think initially they expected they were going to do more of a big set piece where it would all flow. But I think the fact that it cuts in that newsreel manner really works quite well.
No, I like it. It's very frantic and disjointed, and it feels like, as you say, like combat footage.
So we get things like MG34s, K98Ks. There's an MG42.
Yeah.
And then there's more interesting stuff. Like there's 2 scenes with Panzerfausts, which you wouldn't expect to see. There's a Raketenwerfer, or Raketenwerfer 43, which is sort of like a wheeled rocket launcher that was a precursor to the Panzerschreck.
Yeah, that comes right in the end, doesn't it? It's just at the side of a road.
Yeah, it's sort of there. There's a scene where there's a 25mm Hotchkiss anti-tank gun firing. There's mortars. It's just, the list goes on. There's MP40s, and there's even in some of the behind the scenes stuff that I don't know whether made it into the film. There's an Irma EMP, which is a very interesting submachine gun, which was sort of a second line weapon.
But it makes sense historically when you think about it, because obviously everything that's in this movie, everything that's British can't exist.
Yeah, no Stens.
No Stens, no Pierts, no number 4 Lee Enfields, nothing like that, because we just don't have the time to make them because we've been invaded and occupied.
Exactly.
So everything that is in it, for me at least, from Mollo's point of view, is a conscious choice to include. So it begs the question of, okay, so the Germans still create a Jag Panther. So do they still make the SG-44? Do they still make the Tiger tank? Because they're still fighting the Russians.
I reckon they would. So I reckon a lot of German sort of weaponry would have been the same because they're fighting on the Eastern Front. And that was the main driver for such a long time where, North Africa and Italy were sidelined. And for the bulk of the war, they were fighting on the Eastern Front. So they were creating weapons for that front. So Jag Panthers, SG-44s, which aren't in the film, but you got to remember that these are anti-partisan forces. These aren't frontline guys. They're lucky to have the Jag Panther.
Things like that could be still on the back burner. I just think it's very interesting that they might create something as grand and big and expensive as a Jag Panther, and they send it to England to be like a show of strength.
Yeah.
So that's how I assume that gets there.
That's how I'd read it too. I think you're right there.
Because I also assume within the film's narrative that they're also fighting the partisans in Eastern Europe and the resistance in France as well. So I assume the Nazis the German war machine has all these little hotspots they need troops in as well. And they're gearing up to fight America if they come in as well. So it's
exactly. Well, the 7th Fleet's off Cork, isn't it? It says at the beginning. The amount of kit in it is just insane.
I looked at the British Liberation Army, so we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves, but you can watch this film online. It's findable. So later on in the film, we find out that the Americans have made some sort of landing in the east coast of Britain. You're not quite sure where, but they're coming up sort of through Gloucester way. It's all sort of a little bit as and when it needs to be.
My headcanons is they landed in Wales.
Yeah, I think they'd land in Wales. Yeah. Possibly. Maybe try
plenty of beaches in northwest Wales that make great landing beaches.
Maybe they try and crack Swansea as a port. Who knows? It never gets brought up.
Depends who's in command. If it's MacArthur that's in command, then obviously he would hit Bristol and shoot across to London.
He'd try and nuke Scotland off the face of the map, wouldn't he? If it was MacArthur. The British Liberation Army come in, and I think that's just great. That's I love things like alternative history like that.
It's a great touch.
It's brilliant. When you see them, you only see a few glimpses of them really, but they're all dressed like sort of Tito's partisans. They've all got like the belts and the leather jerkins and cap comforters.
And they've got like a communist flag too.
That's another really interesting layer. So I assume there's a truck of communist troops that come, not troops, sorry, a truck of communist partisans that come in at the end and absolutely massacre a lot of German prisoners. But I'm thinking, okay, so are they a separate faction then to the American and the British Liberation Army? So then I got a whole sort of Spanish Civil War vibe from it, where you've got the communist sympathizers, the anarchists, the pro-republican, maybe the pro-monarchy as well.
Yeah.
There's a set of wargaming rules that are about the British Civil War. So I'm thinking now, okay, so after this movie then, do the Germans get deposed and then there's a British Civil War because of all these separate factions?
Yeah.
So is it very interesting? But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Well, you've got parallels in the resistance in France. There were communist groups of resistance as well, weren't there?
Yes, of course. I didn't think of that until just now. But yeah, you've got American officers. There's an American officer that you see. He's wearing M43 jacket, which is nice because that's, for me, then that just proves that the Americans are gearing up for a war. They're still making all the kit. British forces are sort of arming themselves with whatever they can find. So there's an M1928 Thompson with a drum mag. There's captured K98s. There's captured MG42s.
That cloud of blank from the MG34 when he opens up on the Germans, that partisan.
Yeah, God, he goes for it, doesn't he?
The cloud of smoke from that blank fire is. And he's sort of like squatting and sweeping them and he's loving it. They're having a blast, isn't he?
He's giving it a bit of Tony Montana, isn't he? Yeah. I just like aesthetically, I like their look. I like the sort of bits of battle dress here and there, bits of webbing. It's quite interesting. Yeah, and also as well, another thing, and it's a fighting on film staple. There are Bedfords in it.
Of course, I was waiting.
Yeah, Bedford OY, I think, is in there. The partisan troops, anti-partisan troops turn up in. But I think another thing as well, that's good because that shows them using captured kit and just using what they've got. Because obviously that's what they did.
Well, the Hotchkiss 25mm was captured. That would have been captured. Because a load of those were taken over by the BEF.
The only thing I wished for was like a captured Bren gun carrier.
Ooh, yeah.
That would have been cool.
Yeah, that would have been good. Surely the Tank Museum or Mark Dyneley could have lent him a Bren gun carrier.
Maybe not. But it's just as I said, the kit in it and the attention to details within the separate factions that turn up at the end is just impressive. Again, it just echoes what we said. Everything there's a purpose to everything, and it just enriches the film.
It does. So when Pauline gets to the aid station at the end, the guy that meets her is his shoulder titles, got him tabbed up as Royal Army Medical Corps.
That's it, yeah.
And when the chap's in a pub, I think it's a pub that they're at, and there's a Royal Engineer that arrives to ask, is there anyone, any medical personnel that we can use at the front? And they mentioned that Pauline's been captured. He's a Royal Engineer. And my headcanon's like, they've just blown that railway line.
It's his expertise there.
He'll have laid the charges on that railway line that they've just blown that Pauline was travelling on. Just clever.
So my actual pick this week for my genuine Alley pick.
Good, I was going to ask.
Yeah, it was the propaganda posters that you see. They just add a really believable element to the movie. So when Pauline makes it, she's decided she wants to work as a nurse because it's what she's done. That's her profession. Yeah. So she goes to the IA Labour Centre to get some work.
Yeah.
And so he goes into the offices, and behind the main desk, there's a poster for, join the English division of the SS.
Yeah, the British Legion. And harking back to that little scene you were talking about at the end, the surrender, that those lads have got, get this nice little tight close-up of Black Prince Legion unit insignia, which was a real thing.
Exactly. Really nice little addition there. They've got their own Union Jack flag badge that they wear underneath the eagle. And then there's one that's like Bolshevism is death. And then there's one that the IA have, which is Union is Britain's strength, which I think is just beautiful. Like, someone's really thought of what a mass fascist British movement would have as their slogans and their posters.
There's Labour posters where it's Working Germany, and there's one that has bombs falling, and it looks very sort of very much in the style of both German and British war posters.
Yes.
And it's about bombing Germany, or German bombs bring death.
That's
like
it, yeah. So it's
sorry, American bombs bring death.
Bring death, yeah. So that they're telling them who the enemy is, I guess.
Yeah.
But then there's also another great little addition as well, where Pauline meets an officer or a work officer. I'm not sure, he's never really named of who he actually is. This sort of like IA officer who's delegating the work to Pauline. And behind Pauline, when she's sitting in his office, there is a uniforms and insignia of Immediate Action organization, like poster right behind her. And it must have been hand painted, but it's all the rank and like the badges and the sort of like the sleeve cuffs and all things like that of what they would wear. And I'm thinking, the attention to detail is already brilliant, but for them to be really thinking about how an organization would have things like that just up on walls and things, it's that extra level of detail.
Absolutely.
I was saying to Matt, when we were like researching and talking about the movie together before we recorded, like, it's one of the few movies where occupation is the plot. It's not like ancillary to it.
Yeah.
So like SSGB, when it was filmed, when the BBC did an adaptation a few years ago, for me, it just felt like the fact that England had been invaded was just like
the backdrop, wasn't it, really?
The backdrop to like a pretty middling detective story. But like this, it is just the plot. It's like how someone views occupation and it's not even really how she feels about it at some points. It's just sort of, she's a little bit numb to it.
It's just her transition, isn't it? From being a victim of occupation to accepting it. And going back to the posters, I think it's just such a simple, cheap, easy way of creating that mise en scène.
Yeah.
5 or 6 poster designs, you get them plastered up in a similar way to whatever was appearing in that book that they had of the occupation of Paris. And you've got instantly that vibe.
Yeah. And they're all obviously modelled on genuine posters. So I'm looking at one now for the Dutch SS volunteers, and it's like, in Dutch it reads, which one of these two is the real Dutchman, and it's like like the collaborator and the non-collaborator.
Yeah.
And there's like, it looks like an SS volunteers going into battle, and the English mock-up poster is pretty much the same as that. So I just really like, everything's really believable. Yet again, it's that word, everything's just really authentic and believable, and that just adds that level of professionalism to the whole film and the level of believability. But that's my alley pick, really.
I mean, for mine to pick out of that huge plethora of interesting kit, I think the Jagdpanther is the one there, isn't it? That is the standout, and it's such a surprise. I was amazed by it when I watched the film, but then as I was reading How It Happened Here, Brownlow's book, and it reads that they borrowed that and a half track from the Bovington Tank Museum for the morning, is incredible. That they're letting this probably about 19, 20-year-old making an amateur film come in and borrow a huge armored vehicle. It's incredible.
Was it the half track? I remember listening to the director talking. He said, well, the half track didn't move, so we had to tow it.
Yeah. There's some great behind the scenes footage of it being towed through a village, and all the lads just sat in the back of it, and there's a tow. It's great.
Yeah, it looks good. It looks great. But that Jagdpanther is really imposing, isn't it?
It's huge.
It shows the might of the German army at that time without telling you.
Definitely. And there's actual professional productions that would have killed to get that kind of armor on a set. But I think time to move on to fave scenes.
I think so.
There's so many standout sequences in the film that I can't really just pick one. So I'm going to be greedy this week and pick a couple.
Yeah, like my whole film is my favourite bit this week. I genuinely really love this one.
It's rare that you get a film, even an amateur film, where you go, it really works quite well. We've already talked about that beginning of seeing the Nazification of Britain with Pauline's walk through London and, seeing the ghetto, etc. Once we get through that scene of her being recruited by the IA officer, she goes into this training montage, which is like something straight out of The Way Ahead.
It's
countless
very
other
way
sort
ahead,
of
like
training montages where she's dressed up in black battle dress and jack boots, and she's running through rubble with stretchers and doing anatomy lessons, which she doesn't need because she's a district nurse, but she's redoing them anyway.
Well, they say they're going to send you on a refresher course.
Yeah.
But then it's just clear that the refresher course is an indoctrination into the Union of Fascists.
Absolutely, because we get that big speech, don't we? Super interesting in the period this is being made where civil defense is becoming a thing again, and all of that training, apart from the indoctrination and the shooting of Webleys, which is a bit weird for a paramedic, basically what she's training to be. It's so interesting that they show them moving through rubble and training on ambulances, which is all sort of stuff that a lot of people would have been familiar with from wardens during the war, ARP,
yes.
Fire Brigade, Auxiliary Medical Corps, all that kind of stuff. And then the civil defense stuff that was beginning to start up again in the late 50s, early 60s. So you've got little touchstones that people would recognize from the audience of the period when it came out in 64. But I just really like the way that it shows her sort of transition into going from reluctantly being an occupied citizen to accepting occupation. There's even scenes where she's kind of like, this does make a bit of sense.
Yeah, she kind of just softens to their ideas. I don't think she lumps in all of her views, but she certainly just, she's like, okay, I kind of, you can see her sort of like, oh, okay, yeah. That could make sense there.
There's two distinct scenes where they're on a fire line firing a 38 Webley. They're very reluctant at the beginning, and then, by the end of the montage, they're just blasting away with it. And you think, they're supposed to be medical orderlies. Like, why are they learning to shoot? It just kind of makes you wonder what role that the IA are going to thrust these people into. So I think that montage kicks off a lot of tropes.
Yes.
Within, sort of filmmaking of those kind of training sequences. But it works really well. Background of like thumping German marching music again. And
you get the speeches, don't you? And you get to learn more about IA's actual stance on things. It's like, okay, you're just fascists then. You're just a fascist regime. You're the National Socialist Party with a different coat on. It's very like that, isn't it?
It is, and it's that scene and a couple of others where there's the marching band. The German marching band is moving through London, and then there's also these it's another montage, great sequences where there is just Germans on R&R, various tourist spots around London, Albert Hall, Trafalgar Square, etc., and they're getting snapped in front of things, and they're just like pointing to stuff, and it's very much like that scene in Red Dawn where the Russians go up on the scenic drive in the national park, and they're like getting a photograph in front of the.
Just echoes the Nazis in Paris, doesn't it?
It does.
It's that thing. I assume that because it says that London's like a demilitarized city, and you're like, well, yeah, it's just a retreat now, isn't it? It's just like it's another capital in Germania, or whatever they were going to call it. What they were going to call the Greater Reich or whatever. It's just another nice little place to visit if you're on R&R from the Eastern Front. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. What's your favourite scene, Rob?
After that montage that you were talking about, we get a little scene where Pauline's just trying to relax in what I assume is like their like rest house or like their clubhouse or something.
Yeah. It's like a mess
or head offices,
like reading room type thing, isn't it? Yeah.
She's trying to read, and all the books are IA slant on them, or they're like British version of the Spiegel.
I love the little scene in one of the montages where it walks past a newsstand, and it's got all of the German publications.
Yeah, it's nice, isn't it?
Where it would have been like War Illustrated and stuff. It's Nazi publications. It's kind of
the Signal. It's like the Signal, isn't it?
Yeah.
And she puts on the radio, and her friend's like, and it's like it's like a party political broadcast from the leader, and you're like, okay, it's not really explained to it, but it's clearly Hitler, having a bit.
She turns it off.
But then they go to the cinema. We get a whole newsreel played for us, like a recreation of what a German newsreel or propaganda piece would have been made for British consumption, and we get the whole thing from beginning to end. And it's called Mirror on the World. So the film is how England came to be occupied by the Germans from a German point of view, which is insanely weird notion to watch.
It's jarring, isn't it?
Very jarring, but very, very sort of believable from a Nazi propaganda machine point of view. It always sounds uneasy, but if you can look at it, if you step back from it, it does make a lot of sense. But in a sort of
the spin on it is very clever.
Yeah, but it's all done like sort of sinisterly. You're not sure if what you're watching is real or recreated for the camera, or so it starts by saying, Anglo-German friendship has been there since the days of Waterloo, and we've always been friends, but the propagandists in the First World War, they tried to ruin it. But the men came together at Christmas time and had a football match, and we're all friends, and they knew what was right. They knew we were friends. Yeah. And you get this, like, the news cameras captured it perfectly, and it's like lads shaking hands in no man's land. But then I was thinking, no, that's not right, because there's no film of that. There's no, they've recreated that, haven't they? That's the propaganda slant there. It's all very sinister. It puts you sort of on edge. They're controlling the narrative. They're saying that it was the corrupt government of England that made the war happen, and we're the liberators, and we're freeing you from your Bolshevik shackles and all this sort of thing. You're like, Jesus, this is all very sort of on the nose.
Yeah, and it's all they blame the British government for slowing the war effort against the dreaded Bolsheviks in the East.
The forces of world communism.
They should have surrendered and joined the war effort against the Bolsheviks, that kind of thing, isn't it?
Yeah. And we're the only people that have replaced your government with a government that works. And we've set up the legions, and they've gone to fight communism. Isn't everything wonderful? But then there's these other little sinister things that are dropped in, and I think they're just dropped in as like, oh my God, like really, that it's like a blink and you'll miss it thing, where they sort of go, oh, we've reinvented this, we've reintroduced this, oh, we've dealt with the Jewish problem, but there's labor force now, so you can get a job. And it's like, hang on a minute, you did what? Yeah. Whoa, hang on. And I'm thinking, Jesus Christ, like, they've just openly admitted that they've started they started a Holocaust here. And I'm like, oh my God, that's just a flippant remark. Yeah. But when you really delved into it, it's just so sinister and horrible and sort of just nonchalant, like it's nothing. It's completely horrible. But then the way that Pauline views it, she's just sitting there watching it like, oh, okay. She's just sort of just like, oh, okay.
It's passive, isn't it? She's just someone sat in the cinema, listening, watching the news as anyone would have done.
Exactly, yeah. But the way that the movie is shot as well, it's shot on 16mm film reel, so it feels real.
Most of it is, yeah. And well, it doesn't actually say in the book, but I reckon probably maybe a third or a quarter of it is on 16mm, and then they get some 35mm, which was donated by Stanley Kubrick of all people, which is another incredible little piece of trivia from this film. Just to move away from the newsreel for a second and explain the Kubrick connection. Brownlow ran into him at a cinema in London and got talking to him about Path to Glory. He was basically just gushing about Path to Glory and how much he enjoyed it, which is a great movie. And must have mentioned his own film, and Kubrick said, how are you doing for film stock? And Brownlow admits that 35mm goes through pretty quick. And Kubrick says, well, here's what you do. You call my secretary and ask her for the short ends of our reels from Dr. Strangelove.
Yeah.
So at least half or maybe 2/3 of this movie is shot on leftover film stock from Dr. Strangelove. It's incredible. I mean, without that donation, the film probably wouldn't have been finished.
Did he say he was worried that he'd have superimposed Peter Sellers all the way through it if he used the footage or something?
Yeah, double exposed Peter Sellers.
Yeah, he was really worried about it. To bring us back to the newsreel, it's how you do exposition, isn't it? In a movie like this, you don't need people to go, aren't the Nazis horrible? Oh, aren't the Nazis great? You don't need people to say that.
No.
This movie does it all for you in a way that you can just accept because it's a movie within a movie.
Yeah, and you've got that great little bit of what looks like newsreel from an Oswald Mosley sort of speech, and you get this Cable Street vibe where there's a big scuffle.
Yes.
And that was all filmed on a 1922 16mm hand cranked camera, which they loaned from the BBC for the very purposes of creating that sort of 16mm film stock vibe. With the clunky, having to crank it as you're moving.
Yeah, that guy really looked like Mosley. I thought that was real footage then.
He did, and I think he was like a production assistant from the same company that Brownlow worked in, according to the book.
Right, not Mosley himself, you mean?
No, he just really looks like it. The black shirts and the back stand on the back of a truck. And
yeah.
The flags behind him. It just worked really well.
It did look really real, didn't it? And I think that's another thing that whole news. If you found that on YouTube, and it was just in its own little bit, you'd think it was real. Take it out of the context of the film. It does feel real. But then that feeds into this whole fascinating little scene where Pauline's back in the clubhouse after they've seen the movie, and they're talking to these two old sweat sort of fascists.
Original black shirts.
Genuine right-wingers They're talking openly, but they're doing it within the context of the movie. And I feel that the cast are just asking them questions. So this bit of the movie was actually taken out by United Artists because
There's about 7 minutes that were cut out. Yeah. Well, luckily Brownlow got the rights back to the film, so we managed to get it put back in.
Okay, but that scene is just really interesting. Hearing how people who actually believe that sort of thing.
It's really disturbing.
It is, isn't
really
it?
disturbing, because we've got these two guys which are clearly fascist, and it's a super controversial scene.
Yes.
When the film came out, when it was initially screened to festivals and reviewers, etc., this scene was still in the film before United Artists picked it up, and it caused a massive bit of controversy amongst Britain's Jewish community, naturally, who felt that scene in particular was pretty anti-Semitic. I can understand why.
Yeah.
Because you've got these two guys who are talking about sending Jews to Madagascar. Quite clearly, they would prefer not to be sending them anywhere and just, killing all of them. And these are real people. And apparently, according to the book, Mollo and Brownlow met these guys through looking for kit to put into the films. And unsurprisingly, some of these British fascists had decent collections of surplus Nazi kit, which you can understand they might do. They got to know them, and in the book, Brownlow talks about how uncomfortable it was, getting on quite well with some of these people, but then at certain points in their, their relationship, they'd go round to their house to collect something, and they'd be reminded, and they twig that they're actually fascists.
Yeah.
But that comes into this whole wider thing that I find so fascinating about this film, where they almost kind of naively touch and become fascinated by the Nazification of Britain and fascism during the war, where they're bringing in former German officers, some of whom are SS. So you're dealing with people that seem on the surface of things as quite normal and, pleasant. When in reality, these people have very dodgy views, to put it lightly. These people are fucking Nazis. And it makes you feel very uncomfortable watching the film, knowing that those two gentlemen are actual fascists. Yeah. And knowing that a lot of the little bits of, scenes that were shot in certain parts of the film were made with the assistance of former Nazi officers and SS members. And it does make you wonder what the motivation of Mollo and Brownlow was. But I think, having read the book, you get a sense that they're looking to sort of allow these fascists to sort of talk themselves into their own grave. Okay. They're allowing them to sort of share their views openly for everyone viewing the film to be like, fuck me, these people are abhorrent, you know?
Yeah.
And it's quite clear
sort of like a war game-esque sort of thing where you present all the facts to then say, isn't that fucking shit? Yeah, let's not have that, please. That's what I got from it.
There's that bit where one of them is sort of talks about euthanasia, and he talks about it as like a medical procedure, and a doctor does it every day, cutting off dead tissue, which foreshadows the end of the movie, which you don't know when you're watching that scene. If on the first watch, you don't know what's coming.
Brings into the movie a sort of sense of, well, if you're going to be part of this IA organization, then you better be damn well fucking clued up on what they're doing in the background. Then this is what I was going to say in final thoughts, but I think it makes sense to say it now. I think the movie, for me, in my opinion at least, presents both sides of the coin. It's like, do you want to collaborate, and do you want to know what you're collaborating with?
Yeah.
Or do you want to resist and take the chances of being killed or captured or whatever?
That's how the original trailer sort of posits it, isn't it? It asks you those questions.
And then there's this horrible middle ground where you're just going to go along with whatever happens, and you're just going to tunnel vision it and get on with your life.
Yeah.
In the movie, it shows all three of those things. At the end, it shows you what the resistance movement is going to be like. It shows you what it shows you what living in that is like. And then in the middle, it shows you what being in it is like. So I don't actually think the movie really poises it as a good or bad thing.
No.
But I think it's asking us as the audience, what do we think and what would we do?
Yeah, that's exactly it, I think.
And heaven forbid we ever have to make that choice, because I think it's such a difficult position. And you can see Pauline all the way through it, where she thinks she's sussed it, and then something will happen, and then she's really not sure. By using an amateur actor, I think she herself is thinking about these things on a more of a moral level than perhaps an actor would, because you'd think about it as a job, you think about it as a script, but maybe perhaps the way the movie was made and it's sort of embedding themselves with these sort of people, you actually get to think about it more than you would on another sort of set, you know? So I think that from a moral point of view, the movie is so interesting.
Well, her face throughout that scene is really fascinating.
Very pensive.
She's there positing questions. And at one point, the two Nazis, they're arguing with each other about how they would deal with certain Jews that have skills. And one of them is being pragmatic, air quotes, and saying that they have skills and, you know, we can use them. Whereas the other one's saying, well, I don't want to use their skills. They should all be sent to Madagascar.
Yeah.
And that in itself is shocking that
it is.
These two have got conflicting views. But I think that whole scene is really interesting, that they're trying to show these people's opinions in the broad, you know, light of day. In the book, Brownlow describes them going to a rally of Oswald Mosley's, and it makes you wonder. You're watching this film where it's two fascists on screen, and you have to wonder about their motivation to go to that kind of rally. But Brownlow does make it clear in the book that he and Mollo did challenge in a question and answer session some of the things that Mosley was saying about Africa and how he no longer opposed Jews.
I mean, I guess it's a mark of a good filmmaker. If you're doing research, like an actor preparing for a role, you know, if you're preparing to play someone like that, then you might go and find out what it's like to be at one of those rallies. So again, it's like more props to them for actually going to something like that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is another mark of that perhaps naive fascination, where they've been so, you know, interested in trying to get into this mindset of why these people would do that. They thought they would go to this event. But yeah, and I think my favorite scene is actually one that follows that, and it's with Sebastian Shaw's character, the doctor. When Pauline reaches London, she goes and visits two old friends that she hasn't seen since probably 1940, and she pays a visit to them. And she takes off her coat, and she's got her IA uniform on, and they are aghast.
Yeah,
they are clearly leaning towards the partisan sort of mindset, but they're a family. They have a young daughter. They can't really do much. On another subsequent visit, where this scene occurs, Pauline arrives, and they're not too pleased to see it because they have a wounded partisan in their flat that they're trying to, you know, tend to. And we get this really interesting conversation between Pauline and the doctor. And Sebastian Shaw's character, to me, it seems that he's doing a rebuttal to everything that was occurring in that scene where the fascists are laying out their views.
Yes.
He talks about how fascist tendencies have to be treated as a disease. He talks about the terrible thing about, I think the exact line is, the appalling thing about fascism is that you have to use fascist methods to fight it. And he's quite clearly coming down to the sort of partisan side of things. And Pauline says, well, I thought that way too, until all of my friends were killed by partisans. And that made me think that neither side is as good as the other.
Mm.
And then Shaw's line about using fascist methods to fight fascism is another piece of foreshadowing to that scene at the end with the surrender that you mentioned earlier, Rob, where the partisans shoot a number of Germans that have surrendered. It just shows that humans are capable of a lot. And I think Shaw's little monologue in that scene is a powerful little rebuttal to some of the very unpleasant stuff that the fascists were saying after the cinema scene.
It's all choices, isn't it? It's all choices that people make where they lie, not necessarily what their real allegiances are, rather what they're just going to do to get through it. You could just pick any scene from this movie and it's a good scene to analyze.
There's so many, isn't there, that just work really well. But yeah, I think that scene with Shaw is my favorite.
Hello, I'm Al Murray, and you're listening to Fighting on Film, the world's #1 war film podcast.
I think we should wrap up with final thoughts like we always do. I've thoroughly really enjoyed this movie. A fascinating film, because when have you ever gotten like a big hour-and-a-half long what if movie? It's like when we were talking about the BAOR films, it's that what if thing that is interesting. I find that on a certain level, I find it very, very interesting. And I just wish there was a sequel that was all about the point of view of the resistance.
Yeah, I mean, one of my criticisms of the film is that it just ends too soon. I want to know what happens. I suppose we can just briefly run over, towards the end of the plot there. Pauline is transferred to a hospital in the countryside, and it seems like the most beautiful, idyllic place imaginable.
It's like something like a Heartbeat almost, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's driven there from the station. It's a big country house. It's a TB hospital. The staff are all wearing, actual nurses' uniforms rather than battle dress. And she gets a nice comfy bed, and she gets to be a proper nurse again. She's not an orderly, and she's not, running around rubble. She's going to be a proper nurse.
Yeah.
So she gets to make beds and get instruments ready and that sort of thing. And she's very pleased to be back into, what seems like a normal hospital. And all is not as it seems. And we get that foreshadowing of the euthanasia conversation that she had with the fascists.
Yes.
In Brownlow's book, he talks about how he took inspiration for this part of the film. They didn't really know what they were going to do in the third act. And it's basically pretty much based on accounts from the Hadamar trial, which was a trial based on attendants that had worked at a mental hospital,
right,
in, I believe, Germany, who had, once all of their patients had been killed, they continued to be a euthanasia center, basically. And that is pretty much what we get in this idyllic country hospital. It's an old TB hospital, which is, there's one literally maybe like 4 or 5 miles away from me.
Oh wow!
An old TB hospital. So it kind of came home for me. I was like, wow, she's taken advantage of. They don't explain what is going on. They put up a facade, and this truckload of Polish laborers that have been working at building a new harbor in, I think, Kroma is mentioned. And they're all ushered into these nice, crisp, clean beds, made comfortable, put into nightgowns. And then the pretense is that they're going to have an infectious diseases inoculation.
Yep.
And they begin administering this. And then they hand it over to Pauline and say, "Can you finish this off, please, nurse?" And she does. And there's a heart-rending little scene with a little boy who is handed a stuffed toy by the matron before she leaves, knowing what they're doing.
Obviously, we don't know as a viewer.
We don't know. We're like Pauline. We don't know what the hell's going on. We're like, oh, she's finally in this nice hospital. Where's this going? The next morning, she clocks off. Next morning, she comes down on early rounds. The beds are empty. No one's about. And they're looking around. She's looking around, for a member of staff, the nurse, the matron, the doctor, whatever. She walks through the gardens, and then behind some trees, the groundskeepers are digging a pit to bury the Polish.
There's shallow graves, isn't it?
Yeah.
Shallow graves. Yeah.
To bury the Polish labourers. And you realise she's killed them all. It does a smash cut to her on the train, handcuffed to a Nazi officer. And then we get those two little vox pops at the nurse. And the matron explains, well, we were always a TB hospital, and the authorities wanted us to keep up the pretense. And then another nurse says, well, if I'd refused, they would have sent me to a concentration camp.
Yeah.
And again, it's hitting you with those questions of what the hell would you do if you were posed in that situation?
Only few times in the film where euthanasia, concentration camps, genocide.
Yeah.
It's the only parts of the movie that are ever sort of hinted on it. But it's very hard hitting.
Powerful.
And then to cut from that, the resistance blow up the train she's on. And then she finds herself with the resistance as a nurse for them. And then you get that whole bit with the British Liberation Army and stuff. And then the film just ends. It's her just administering patients again. It mirrors her whole experience throughout the whole film. She's in one place, she's in another place, then she ends up in another place. I like that because it never settles into one thing enough for you to start making a formed opinion on what you would do or how you feel about the situation. It lets you do it in the credits, or it lets you do it on the walk home from the cinema, and I really like that.
I think Pauline Murray's performance is so nuanced. It's such a shame that she never felt like doing it again, because
she's so believable. She's very meek. She's very softly spoken. She feels like a real person.
You can't imagine being thrust into that situation, that's what the film does. It posits, what would you do? And she portrays someone who is pretty much dumbfounded. She's seen a lot of her friends get murdered at the beginning of the film.
Yeah.
She gets to London. There's a great little close-up of her shabby shoes on the floor. And then following her graduation from the IA, there's a little scene on a bus where she's looking down at her feet and she's wearing shiny black shoes. And she's pleased. She's got a uniform, she's got a job, she's nursing again.
Yeah.
And then we get that, disquieting scene with the fascists and explaining their views. And then she has the confrontation with Shaw's character. And she's second guessing again. And I just like the way this film walks you through her thought processes. And the transition she makes from accepting occupation to then being so shocked about what she's been tricked into doing in the hospital, that she is willing to see herself sent to a concentration camp the implication is that, she's handcuffed to a German officer and that's going to be her fate. Yeah. And there's a little scene as she gets into a Kubelwagen to go off to the aid station. She takes off her armband. It's very, very quick. You don't really notice it, but I watched it a couple of times and I noticed that she just takes that off and drops it to one side as she gets in to go and work at the aid station. Yeah, I just think there's so many little aspects to this film that really lift it above what you would expect from an amateur film.
It's all very nuanced. It's a really affecting film. It's like it didn't harass me as much as The War Game did, but it certainly has that same uneasy feeling of, well, gosh, how do I feel about all these things that are poised? What's my opinion? What's my view on it? It's a movie that wants you to think. For a movie about the effects of war rather than war itself, I think it's a really good one. I don't know what else I can say.
It really is.
It should be up there. I mean, I know the BFI did a remastered Blu-ray release, didn't they, a few years ago? But it should be up there, viewed in the same way that the War Games viewed it as an anti-nuclear war film. This movie should maybe be poised as an anti-fascist movie.
Well, it poses the question: is what would you do? That's it. That's the basic question.
Yeah,
it's the most base thing of how would you react to being thrust into that situation.
Exactly.
It aspires so high and it hits so many marks. It's not a perfect film, obviously. The story of its production alone is almost as interesting as the film itself. You've got people like Kevin Brownlow, who goes on to be a respected historian of cinema. He edits The Charge of the Light Brigade in '68. He makes a film about Winstanley and the Diggers. You've got Peter Sushitsky, who goes on to be a cinematographer in films made by Peter Watkins, David Cronenberg, who works on Empire Strikes Back. Andrew Mollo goes on to work as a consultant on Dr. Zhivago, The Eagle Has Landed, The Pianist, Downfall.
Yeah.
He's production designer on all of the Sharp films. It's incredible. And then you've got Peter Watkins in the background as an uncredited production assistant. I would definitely encourage everyone to look into the production of the film, and I think also look into the reaction of contemporary reviewers to that anti-Semitic accusation and the decision to remove that scene. I don't think the film wouldn't work without that scene. I think it would work quite well. There's enough in that newsreel to suggest the euthanasia and the attitudes of the fascists that would balance well with what Shaw's character has to say in that discussion with Pauline. But I do think that extended scene of the chat with the fascists probably lays out their opinions a little more broadly that people can see and get an idea of. And it's a warning, isn't it, really? That scene is a warning of these people still exist. These are opinions that, were pervasive then and are now. And then we have Shaw's reaction to this, and we can form our own opinions
of course.
from watching that discussion. But absolutely fascinating film. And I'm so glad that the patrons decided to pick this one, because this is the forerunner. This comes before Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle. This is before SSGB. This is before a whole plethora of sort of like what if occupation
scenarios,
scenario like literature and films and books and such. And it's just not many people seem to know about it. Like I spoke to a few friends and they were like, no, I never heard of it.
But if you were a fan of the War Game, if you were a fan of Culloden, this will be right up your alley. And we really would say seek it out.
It's one I've been really wanting to do for a while now. So I'm glad we've finally done it.
So as you might have seen on the Twitter, next week we are going to be starting Dirty Dozen December.
We're diving in with our grease guns, getting in with some criminal sorts, and we are going to be tackling not one but 4 Dirty Dozen films over the course of December.
Didn't even know they made that many.
Yeah, I didn't until we had this idea like 4 months ago, where I was like, what should we do for December? And the alliteration won out. I would have happily have done Where Eagles Dare, which is an ultimate Christmas war movie for me anyway.
There's been a few Twitter followers that have been like, when are you doing it? We're like, we just had to play it cool because we didn't want to give away the game away.
I want to do it too, but I think Dirty Dozen December is going to be on par with it, I think.
Yeah, it's going to be hella fun.
We're going to have some giveaways and a couple of other special little things, which we'll let you know about in the next week or two, I think.
Yep, keep your eyes peeled on the Twitter and the Facebook.
And we've got a great guest for our first Dirty Dozen December episode.
Dwayne Epstein, who wrote a book about Lee Marvin's career. So stay tuned next week for all that.
So as always, thank you so much for listening. You can find out more about Fighting on Film at fightingonfilm.com. You can follow us on Twitter at Fighting on Film, and we are also on Facebook. Leave a like or a review on whatever platform that you're listening on. And thank you again for joining us. Bye, guys.
Bye.